Angels at the entrance. The girl is behind them, a high candle and black planks on the slope. It's not a fairy tale place. This is the place of sorrow for Ukrainian people. This is the National Museum Memorial of Victims of the Holodomor. It was set up after the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the victims of the Holodomor. 3.5 years had passed since the announcement of the tender and up to the construction of the complex, but it is still being filled with different items. One nationwide volume and 18 regional volumes. There are 18 volumes of the National Book of Remembrance for the Victims of the Holodomor of 1932-1933 concerning those regions in which territories suffered from the famine. This was the part of Soviet Ukraine. One reduced volume tells in general about the history of the Holodomor. More than 13,000 settlements, almost 880,000 names of residents of Ukraine are included in the regional volumes. The information about them was collected piece by piece. When I was preparing the volume of the Book of the National Memory of the Holodomor Victims in the city of Kyiv, we reviewed 49,000 records of death. The National Book of Remembrance of the Victims of the Holodomor is the most complete martyrology today, which contains information about the victims of the Holodomor in 1932-1933. The total amount of published volumes is over 22,000 pages. But in these volumes, in martyrologies, only a little more than 900,000 dead are shown. Today, the views of academicians on the number of victims diverged. Some say there were 10 million dead in Ukraine, others mentioned the figure of 4 million approximately. Where did the rest of the names go? Why are not they in the book? How many victims of the Holodomor are there? And what are the consequences of the sinister crime of the Bolsheviks? On August 7, 1932, the resolution on the protection of the property of state enterprises, collective farms and cooperatives, and on the strengthening of public ownership was adopted. It was also known as the Law of the Five Spica. The resolution legally formalized the mechanism of repression against Ukrainians. On September 16, 1932, the instructions for its execution were issued. Extrajudicial bodies were especially created to implement this law. Those were 3 people: the secretary of the regional committee, the head of the local general prosecutor of Ukraine, and the local prosecutor. That is, without even hearing from the accused person any evidence of their innocence, these 3 people issued death sentences based on the GPU submission. It came into force starting in August 1932, and until the end of the year, it was used for mass use. And at the beginning of the 1933, it was used as a form of terror, regardless of whether a person took spikes or did not, and against theft. Yes, that actually happened. Desperate villagers were forced to attack the storehouses with grain, beets, potatoes and corn. In other words, this was for preparing so-called food. As they said then, people attacked the so-called food, which was difficult to call food anyway, and they were persecuted for the theft of collective farm property or theft in a particular village. Because theft, which had acquired a mass character, was a means of saving the peasants. They too could not be blamed, though they were accused as criminals, but it was the state that forced them to do that. So then the state is not also a criminal? The decision of August 7, 1932 was not only a method of reprisal against Ukrainians, it also served as one of the methods of intimidating the peasants. When the law was published on August 7, 1932, demonstrative judicial proceedings were held in every one of these villages. and the newspapers very widely covered these trials to intimidate the peasants so that they would not dare to put up any form of resistance. Starting in August 1932 and during the first half of 1933, they covered all these demonstrative proceedings against the so-called wreckers, enemies of the people, collective farmers and chairmen of the boards of collective farms. Terror by means of law, known among Ukrainians as 7/8, assumed massive proportions. How many people became its victims is even difficult to imagine today. It's difficult to approximate the scale and the number of convicts subject to this law, because they considered the case for embezzlement. They took this law as the basis, and in criminal sentences they contained criminal articles of the criminal code that were not politicized. That is to say, the Soviet authorities were also covering up their activities there. Since it was not possible to keep the track of all convicts under this law, the names of many of them are not reflected in the National Book of Memory. But the victims of the law on Five Spica are only one part of those people who died during the Holodomor. The other part is the children, orphans, who left their houses in search of a better fate. The fate of many of them remained unknown. Because they were already lost for the village, and the village council did not write down their names in the official registers. The only source that could contain this information was the population census book. But the last census was conducted in 1926, and toddlers up to 1 year old were not registered in this book at all. But they had already grown up by the year 1933. But even in the lists of those who did not leave the village and their fate was known to fellow villagers, not all of them are registered in the book, and this concerns not only children but also adults. There was no mortality records during the Holodomor. This is evidenced by the People's Commissariat of Healthcare. The statistics of that time are also testimony to this fact. The real number of mortality is actually several times higher, that is according to the statistics of the 1930s. The registry offices did not actually register the death rate in 1933. First of all, there was no one responsible for this task, and secondly, the necessary documentation simply was not existent in those years. In addition, peasants who began to die en masse outright refused to register the deaths of their beloved ones. The scale of these deaths can be judged by the example of the village of Pivny, where Zinovy Maslow lived. I'm even afraid to say, just one street. I was a child and did not go out a lot, but I counted 159 people. Those who died just on the street, and this is 1/4 of the population of this small village. And what to register when there were 20-30 corpses on the streets for a week? They were simply ranked up and buried.
У цьому цвинтарові, оце, що ви бачите, 100 років.
The cemetery you see is 100 years old, 100 years exactly. From here up to there, this whole territory is covered with the graves of those who died in 1933. Compare it to the area devoted to the graves of those wwho died over 99 years.
99 років стільки померло, і стільки померло за один рік.
During the years of the Holodomor, peasants lost their fear of death, and there was no holiness in it either, because people were buried not by Christian rites.
Причому тут один покойник лежить.
And there is one dead person here, and here are the common graves.
Ішли в ліс.
My father and I walked into the forest. There was a path, and I saw corpses in the pit and their feet stretched out from it. Bodies of the victims were brought in cars and thrown in these pits.
У ямі лежали трупи і виглядали звідси ноги.
Then the next cart would come, and this procedure was repeated over and over.
Викинуло слідуюче, і засипали їх.
It is interesting that those who committed these crimes were convicted of their impunity and the fact that they would never be revealed. But at the same time, they tried to hide the traces of their atrocities. Somewhere, subconsciously, such an opportunity to open archives probably existed, hence this periodic destruction of documents. And we see such archival lacunas when a researcher realized that there must have been one more official document, but it was simply not there in the archive. The destruction of documents was executed in several stages and for a number of different reasons. The first stage began in the years of the genocide itself. Soviet statistics all over Ukraine were twisted and facts were concealed, so it is very difficult to find the truth today. The acts of death were seized and books containing these records were removed from the village councils and transferred to special departments of the executive committees. And this means that they were kept classified, and what exactly was done with them, nobody can say for certain today. The next stage of concealing this crime and the destruction of hard evidence began in 1937. Then, on January 6th, the all-Union population census was held. A few days after that, a preliminary calculation of the results was made. And on January 20th, 1937, Alexander Osatkin, the head of the Statistical Department of Ukraine, reported to the government of Ukraine the preliminary results. They revealed the fact that Stalin had hoped for an annual growth of 3 million people in the Soviet Union. He even joked, "We will grow by the number of people that equals the population of Finland." But his hopes were dashed. According to the forecasts of Alexander Osatkin made before the Holodomor, the population of Ukraine by January 1937 was supposed to be 35 million people, while the census of 1937 recorded only 28 million people. And when this fact was reported to Stalin, he was simply enraged as his prophecy did not come true. The statistics only confirmed the terrible social and demographic consequences of the terror, and in fact, all the participants of the 1937 census were repressed and destroyed. In the archival and criminal cases of Osatkin, the other prominent statisticians of Ukraine, which are in the possession of the SBU, some interesting information has been preserved. According to archival data, the materials of the preliminary results of the census were preserved in the Management Office of Economic Accounting. That is, they were preserved in the departmental archive, and some materials were liquidated even back then, and some were classified. And taking into account the fact that this was at the end of the 1930s, these documents were preserved in the department archives and were not transferred to the State Classical Archive. 1941. War. A lot of materials kept near Kyiv, Kharkiv or other cities as a result of the occupation of those territories were immediately and quickly destroyed. Targeted destruction of documents. The hasty evacuation and occupation of Ukraine caused the destruction of archived documents, not to mention the long silence and concealment of this crime. All this led to the fact that even 85 years after the genocide, the names of all victims are not known to this day. Even the exact number of victims of the Holodomor has not been established. According to demographers, this number is 4 million people, but Holodomor researchers affirm that this figure is grossly deflated and therefore does not correspond to the actual true figures. Today, such research is being seriously conducted and experts are discovering new documents that were previously unknown, which indicate a much higher number of deaths. October 4th, 2016. An international conference was held where it was stated that in Ukraine at least 7 million people died due to the famine. Millions of dead Ukrainians as a result of the Holodomor of 1932-1933 is one part of the problem. There is yet another problem. The genocide organized and committed by the communists seriously deformed Ukrainian society for many generations ahead. The results of the terrible criminal policy are quite tangible today and are visible in the worst possible manifestations. We see these consequences in the war in the Donbass and in the development of the public mentality. We see long-term transgenerational consequences for the health of Ukrainians, because there are many widespread cases of people suffering from the disease known as type 2 diabetes, and this is the direct consequence of a prolonged period of starvation. Today, in our communication, there are a lot of things that are connected with the consequences of Holodomor of 1932-1933. As a nation, we consume a lot of bread. We even use it in our diets, such foods that are associated with filling the stomach. This feeling of fullness is, so to speak, an indication of the quantity and quality of hunger.
певну пасивність.
We have some passivity in public life because during the Holodomor, the Ukrainians realized that it was necessary to sit quietly and not say a word.
Тихо. І якщо ти виходиш вище середнього рівня, ти обов'язково потрапляєш в поле зору органів компетентних.
The National Book of Remembrance for the victims of the Holodomor of 1932-1933 is not just a perpetuation of those killed as a result of the genocide. This is a reminder to future generations so that such monstrous crimes against humanity will never happen again.